It's not just a Syrian civil war, it's a regional conflict. But I think that there's more that the international community can do, even if it's not able to bring the war to an end.
Right.
There are some relatively straightforward things. I mean, the neighbors of Syria are bearing an unbearable burden, and some of them are close allies.
Reeling under it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the way to think about it is Lebanon is a country of 4 million people, 4.5 million people. It's got 1 million refugees. Just think about it in the US. What would it mean for a quarter of the US population to arrive on your doorstep in the space of 3 years? That's what Lebanon is dealing with. Jordan, 6 million people, 650,000 registered refugees, probably another 650,000 not registered. That's another a quarter of the population. It's like the whole of France and Britain arriving on America's doorstep.
Right.
And so I think the first thing we'd say is that there needs to be much more systematic support for those neighboring countries, because this is not a short-term emergency, it's going to become a long-term emergency. Secondly, I think it's very important not to lose sight of those people who are trapped inside Syria but are beyond UN help. 90% of UN help is going in government-held areas,
right,
even though the rebels hold 45% of the country. And so there are people trapped inside Syria who are not getting very basic help. That's why you've seen these stories of huge ill health, malnutrition, etc. And I think thirdly...
It's essentially a policy of starving people out.
The policy of the Assad regime. Well, it's using the humanitarian need as a tool of war. Mm-hmm. And one of my reflections is that over the post-war period, post-Second World War period, after the Cold War, it seemed that the notion of civilian rights in warfare was being taken increasingly seriously in the international community. After the horrors of the Second World War, it seemed that there was a movement to assert that a non-combatant in a war had needed proper protection. That's what the Geneva Protocols are about. What's been lost in the Syria conflict is the notion that you can be a civilian. And the notion of a non-combatant has been lost. And I think that has very far-reaching implications. In 2005, you'll remember, the international community, all the nations of the UN, effectively, bar 10, passed something called the responsibility to protect.
Yes.
And it said that if a government, the first responsibility to protect citizens is of a government. But if a government doesn't do it, the international community should step in. I mean, that's been lost, clearly. And what you have now is the right to, what I call the right to abuse, seems stronger than the responsibility to protect. And that's what's happening in the Syria conflict at the moment.
That's right. So if you had a wish list, understanding that you're not a politician anymore, what would you say to mostly the European and the US governments that have the capacity to act to do?
Well, I think the first thing is that the capacity to act cannot be done independent of the main players in the region. I mean, there is no extra